Hi, I'm Gale Brewer, Manhattan Borough President, and this is Represent NYC, a Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm sorry about my messy desk, but I am in the office. And I'm glad to be here to talk about two important new programs funded by President Biden's American Rescue Act. And this president, and this vice president, and this Congress, we thank, because they're going to help as a result of this act, and I hope acts to come, thousands of New Yorkers who are hoping to recover from the pandemic. First, we'll discuss the Emergency Rent Assistance Program known as ERAP. This particular program assists renters who fall behind in their rent and hopefully helps them to catch up with their landlords. The money will go to the landlords. The landlords can also, as you'll hear earlier, help by helping the tenant fill out the forms. This is a $2 billion in funding allocated just to New Yorkers, and the state of New York is administering this program. Then after we talk about the housing assistance, we'll talk about the child care tax credit. That kicks in this week. It'll help parents because it'll pay them in New York and across America $300 per child to help raise these children. Now, of course, there's a little bit difference if you're an older child. Both of these programs, as I said, are part of the American Rescue Act passed by Congress last March and signed into law by President Biden. So I want to introduce Jennifer Vallone, who is Associate Executive Director. She has a long title. You could talk about it, Jennifer. She's an advocate. She knows about the arts at one of our very well-known university settlement. This is the settlement house. We always say settlement houses go from cradle to grave. I love that because in every single instance you help people. And in fact, you were, I believe, one of the first settlement houses, if not the first in the United States. I don't think you need to tell people what a settlement house is, but you could very quickly if you want. But more importantly, we want to hear about the Emergency Rent Assistance Program. It's in the news today, yesterday, of some challenges, which the good news I always tell people is it includes what I call ambassadors, you might have a different word, negotiators, people to help you fill out this very long form. So Jennifer Vallone, go ahead and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Gail, thanks for having me. And I'm joining you in the messy office back to our physical spaces world here. So I'm happy I'm not alone. Yeah, I'm Jennifer Vallone. I work for University Settlement. I am the Associate Executive Director of Adults, Arts, and Advocacy. So that means I get to hang out with the grown-ups every day and supervise our housing counseling program, our older adult services, our English classes for adults, some community centers, some of our arts work, and our systems change advocacy. And yes, Gail, you're right. We are the first and oldest settlement house in the country. And a settlement house, I'm biased, but I think they're pretty special places. And they're community-based, neighborhood-based organizations that really, as you say, provide programs that collaborate with our neighbors, really try to identify and reinforce and support every individual and family and our whole community's strengths. And our programs are available to the super cute little ones and our super vibrant older adults and everybody in between. And so almost all settlement houses do youth development, do services for older adults, do mental health work, early childhood development, housing counseling. It runs a gamut, arts work.
Okay, so then the question is, this is a challenging program, great idea. So, and I have to say, I think Jennifer March would agree, one of the challenges we have in New York is keeping our families and individuals in apartments. So yeah. How, thank goodness you've been chosen. I think there are other ambassadors. So why don't you talk about the program and how we're going to get it into the hands of the owners so that tenants don't get evicted. Go ahead.
So obviously, you know, I'm sure that most people have heard the numbers, but tenants in New York City owe billions of dollars in back rent right now after a year and a half of dealing with COVID and dealing with the pandemic. And so that's a huge number. And obviously, once the eviction moratoriums are listed, can lead to some pretty severe housing instability. And so we're super excited to be able to help get ERAP funds into tenants' hands and then landlords' hands. As you said, it's federal funding administered through the state. The city is also involved in contracting with community-based organizations. We're one of them. Catholic Charities is the other one for Manhattan. Both are consortiums, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our partners later. But really, ERAP is here to pay back rent and to make sure that people can stay in their homes. It's available to families who make less than 80% of area median income based on the area in New York State where they live. So, for example, for a family of 2 in New York City, they have to make less than $76,400 a year. For a family of 4, the cap is $95,450 a year. I think one of the good things about this program is that determining income eligibility can happen 2 ways. It can be the last year of a person, or it can be what their income is right now. And so, for example, if I was out of work for the last 12 months, but I recently got hired, and it's a job that puts me slightly over the income cap, I can actually use the last 12 months of my income to determine eligibility for ERAP. So that flexibility, I think, is really great. Other things to note with who's eligible: immigration status is not considered at all in this application process, but college kids who are still dependents on their parents' taxes are not eligible.
Okay, and I know that there is a concern. How is the money getting out? That's one. Then there's a whole issue about how do you find you or Catholic Charities, like you call 311, that issue.
Yeah.
And then, it is a complicated form, so people need to have certain pieces of documentation.
Yeah.
It's pretty extensive. And then, how do you save the form? All that kind of stuff is hard. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is. I want to add 2 things. You need to, when you're applying, be housing unstable, so have some sort of risk of eviction but being in arrears or having a court case obviously does that. And there needs to be some connection to COVID, expenses because of COVID, loss of employment because of COVID. And so if you contact a nonprofit that's doing this work, I know that we can help people figure that out and document that. And that's one of the reasons that we're around. As you said, yes, it's an online application process. I believe that we're going to share the URLs in some capacity during this show. So it's an online application process. For people who are capable of going through that process themselves, they will apply directly to the New York State Office of Temporary Disability Assistance application portal that's been designed. If you need help, there's a state number to call. It's 1-844-691-7368. And then there's a whole bunch of organizations throughout the 5 boroughs in New York City that have been contracted to do this work. I'll give some general information on how to find somebody outside of Manhattan, just in case, and then talk about how to access folks in Manhattan.
Okay, why don't you just talk about Manhattan, because this is a Manhattan neighborhood network. And then we're going to switch over in a few minutes to talk about child credit. But, okay. Go ahead. Just a little bit more. I think one of the questions, do we know how many? We obviously 80% of New York City are renters. I know that there are, 50,000. Just that small number, even before the pandemic ended, were facing eviction in housing court. So give us some numbers as to what we're talking about in terms of who's going to be eligible.
Yeah. So non-immigration status is eligible. Anybody that has rent arrears is eligible. People are able to apply for up to 12 months of rental arrears assistance starting from March 2020. So anything before March 2020 is not eligible. Anything after is eligible. If you have a high rent burden, so high percentage of rent burden, it's possible to get up to 3 months of rent going into the future, and utilities can also be covered. I did want to say you're right. It's a difficult application process. So we've seen in helping people that it takes about 2 hours to complete the application, and you have to finish it when you start it, right? So if you stop halfway through, the portal gets a little wonky, and you're going to have a hard time getting back in. So really, if you're doing this on your own, set aside 2 hours to finish the process. There's also a whole bunch of documents which I'll talk about. That have to be uploaded, which can be challenging for folks that don't have internet, don't have good use of technology, and that's one of the ways that the CBOs who are doing this can help, and that's one of the ways that we can help. Right. And so for us, our hotline number is 332-233-7440. We have an email address. It's erap@universitysettlement, all one word, .org. And website, which is getrenthelples.org. And so University Settlement, the Cooper Square Committee, Good Old Glory Side, and Chinese American Planning Council have teamed up to do application assistance and outreach in 4 zip codes in Lower Manhattan: 1002, 1003, 1009, 113. We speak English, Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, a few other Chinese dialects, and have access to some Eastern European languages through our organizations. If you're outside of those 4 zip codes, then it's Catholic Charities, and their hotline number is 1-888-744-7900, and their email address is cc.erap@Catholic.
Jennifer, thank you very much. I know Harlem Palente is helping Uptown, for instance, too, one of the subcontractors. I guess I would say to everybody, please call and get help, because I know that I would need it. And I'm thinking particularly for those who are most vulnerable, and that's exactly what some of the articles are stating. The most vulnerable will not get the funding, but they will if they call you or they call Catholic Charities. Thank you. We'll come back to you in a minute. So now I'm going to introduce my longtime friend, Jennifer March, who's head of Citizens Committee for Children. It's an organization that has been around for a long time. She could talk about it. And is, I would say, the go-to person for really good policy regarding children in the city of New York. And who knew, Jennifer, that we would survive Trump somehow and then end up with hopefully an administration that understands families. But please talk about CCC and the child care tax credit. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. So quickly, Citizens Committee for Children is an independent child advocacy organization. We've been around working in New York City for 76 years. Our mission is every child should be healthy, housed, educated, and safe. We spend the vast majority of our time looking at government administrative data and engaging community members and direct service professionals to identify across the 5 boroughs policies, programs, and budgetary choices that can help to make New York City a better place for kids and families. Most of our advocacy work is focused on influencing decisions made at City Hall and in Albany, but we do work to help call attention to federal decisions that really can be transformative and impact child and family well-being in positive ways. So Gale, the American Rescue Act, as you've mentioned, actually reforms the child tax credit in numerous ways. And it is estimated that the reforms that we will talk about today may well cut child poverty across the nation in half. That's lifting 5 million children out of poverty. The child tax credit does this by doing 3 things. First, it increases the tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 for children over 6 and to $3,600 for children under 6. It also expands the ages of children eligible, raising the age limit from 16 to 17. And what's really transformative is that the IRS will actually pay the new credit amount in advance monthly payments that will start hitting people's bank accounts tomorrow. So most households with children will benefit from a monthly payment of $250 to $300 per child monthly throughout this calendar year.
That's huge. I know I said by mistake 300 at the beginning, but it is 3,000. Now in the state of New York, there are about 800,000 children, and in New York City, 372,000 in poverty. These are kids in poverty. So that would make an additional, also during the pandemic, another 325 children went into poverty across the state. So it's gonna make a huge difference for the state of New York also, I assume. Talk about how it's gonna impact us.
So, your numbers are correct. There's almost 1 million children statewide living in poverty. And if this initiative is expected to cut child poverty in half nationally, we think that that is true here too in New York State and New York City. So it's going to have a fundamental impact on hundreds of thousands of children here in New York State.
And they don't have to apply. Obviously, university, all the other Catholic Charities are trying really hard to make sure that people know about the tenant financial assistance. But in this case, how do people know they get it? How is the IRS, et cetera? How is the distribution?
So what we think is going to be most transformative is for most family households, this monthly payment will be automatic. So if you filed taxes in 2019 or 2020, you should be getting a payment, either direct deposit, if that is how your refund has traditionally come, or via check, if that is how your refund has traditionally come, which is incredible. So most people will not need to do anything. But for those people that either didn't file taxes or their income is too low to file taxes, it's not too late to actually apply to participate in this program as well.
Wow. And what do you think? Are parents aware of it? Has there been enough education about it? I don't know. It's fabulous, but we all, of course, we want to be out of poverty. We want to figure out what's next for these families. Is there any place that they go for assistance or for questions to be answered, et cetera?
So what is critical, it's important to get the message out to families that if you didn't make enough to file taxes in 2019 or 2020, the IRS has a simple new tool for non-filers to visit childtaxcredit.gov for information, and you can file to claim this credit. If you haven't filed taxes yet, it's not too late. You can go on to the irs.com, fill out the application, and make sure that you will receive a payment every month on the 15th of the month throughout the calendar year. And then in New York City, there are many CBOs like University Settlement and others that are going to help people fill out forms, because people might not have the internet, or there might be language barriers. And so in New York City, you can simply visit newyorkcity.gov/tax credit, or easier, call 311 and say, I need help with tax preparation. All of those ways will get you to the forms needed to fill out so that you too can have a monthly allowance that will help you support the needs of your children and families.
And do you think that either Summer Rising and or DYCD and or Department of Education are helping families with knowledge, et cetera, as a result of those are often the families that would be eligible?
So that's a really good question. We're actually speaking to the City of New York next week. We know that there's a plan underway to engage the nonprofit community. So people providing childcare, youth services, aging services, food security benefits, all the nonprofit community itself is going to be reached through the Department of Community Affairs to make sure that we're getting the word out on social media and in our direct contact with kids and families and daily programs.
Okay. And do you think that there will be, do you have any sense of how many families will, in fact, in the city of New York, like, do we think we'll reach the maximum number of families? God knows we would love to.
I believe so. I think much like with the housing voucher, our real concern are for the most vulnerable. So families that earn so little that they don't actually need to file federal taxes are the families we really need to focus on reaching so that we can help them fill out these forms, and immigrant households as well. So you do not need, as an adult filer, to have a social security number. As long as your children have social security numbers, you can benefit from this credit. And it's super important that we do all that we can to reach the poorest households and immigrant households to make sure they take advantage of this as well.
Now, in terms of the tenant support, that's a one-time. Don't think you're going to get this every single year. So please apply now. In terms of the child credit, what is the length of distribution?
So there's good news, bad news. The good news, it's going to continue throughout the calendar year, tax year 2021. The bad news is it sunsets. But President Biden has already advanced a plan to extend this enhanced child care tax credit for 4 years. And there's advocacy already underfoot, championed by the New York delegation and Senator Schumer, to make the tax credit permanent. So I would say to people, stay tuned. We're going to need to raise our voices and make sure that this allowance, the enhanced child tax credit, becomes permanent.
Okay. So I guess, Jennifer, I say the same thing. This city is so complicated in terms of tenants, right? And how do, the word getting out? We're doing our small portion we have here. We're obviously, telling people in the community, we have flyers that we've been giving out, et cetera. So have other elected officials, community boards. Do you feel like there is enough education about the tenant financial opportunities? And I know we should talk about the owners of the buildings. Are they also cooperating, do you think, in terms of helping their tenants fill out the forms?
I mean, I think that, historically, there have been landlords in New York City that have not been super cooperative. I imagine that will continue through this process. The landlords that we've been collaborating with so far have been receptive to working with us and providing the documents that they've needed. If tenants owe a lot of money, this is an opportunity to recoup that loss, right? I think it's really great that there are a couple of things that landlords need to agree to if they take this money for arrears. And so they need to agree that the amount that they receive from the state covers the arrears for the period of time. They need to agree to not evict tenants going forward for a year. And so there are some requirements for landlords to provide documentation, but also on how tenants are able to stay in their homes for the near future, which is great.
Right. So Jennifer, you have been fighting for this type of support for many years at CCC. I hope that in addition to having this support for the residents and for the children, what else can we do for these families to make sure that this is something that really is getting them out of poverty? Are we going to couple that with jobs for the parents? I don't know. Is there something else that we could be doing? I'm asking because I don't know.
So I think that there's a lot underfoot at the federal level. The infrastructure bill actually makes some incredible investments. There's a new proposal just put forward that might pass as a budget resolution, which could be transformative, that brings resources to make sure that people have access to childcare for infants and toddlers, greater access to UPK. We know that those supports help people remain connected to the labor market. And I think here locally, as we enter into a new administration, there's a lot of opportunity to think about how do we get people back to work, help people improve their education and skill set, and ensure that we're providing the types of supports that are well known in the settlement world to help people live, work, and raise their families here, whether that's childcare, summer programs, youth programs, arts, encouraging civic engagement, because the things we want to hold on to that we've achieved during the stimulus are going to need us all to raise our collective voices.
I agree. And I hope that DOE come September is able to answer some of the questions. That's why I've been advocating for social workers in the schools, because I think if we had that coupled with what you have just described, tenant support, child tax support, we could really help families take that next step. But if the DOE is not on board with learning everything they can about these opportunities, then it's not going to be as successful. So do you think that that's somewhat happening? Because the CBOs are on top of everything. But what about DOE?
So I think that there's, an open debate. There's about $7 billion coming into the city of New York for education. How those resources are spent is an open question. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about social workers, behavioral health care, extracurricular supports for children to make sure that they not only reconnect to school and their peers, but that they're thriving in those settings and in their after school and summer settings. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to shape the discussion about what the school day, school year, and year-round supports for kids and families look like.
I'm hoping that University Settlement is able, with all of your partners and here as well as uptown and throughout the borough, is able. How do you coordinate the different tenants coming into the different settlement houses and nonprofits like?
Yeah, so for the 4 partners that are part of the consortium, we have different language capacities. We have different hours, which is why we picked these 4 partners, because we're in different geographic areas in the 4 zip codes. Some of us are used to working early. Some of us are used to working later. Some of us are used to working on the weekend. We all speak different languages. We have weekly calls. We are constantly emailing each other. So I think we're pretty well organized within our consortium. And then we are also in communication with Catholic Charities so that we have regular communication with them around what we're seeing. And they will send people to us if they're in our zip codes, and we will send them to Catholic Charities if they're in Catholic Charities zip codes. But one thing that's really important is that we don't want to send tenants on a wild goose chase, right? And so if somebody comes and they have a question and they're from outside of our zip code, then we're going to answer their question. Right. We're not going to send them off to try to find help somewhere else. So it really is a collective effort.
Housing, NYCHA, you have a household max. So
No.
Can you talk about that? Because that does come up with some families.
It will not trigger a reduction in other types of supports that you are entitled to, which is phenomenal.
So in other words, whether you are HUD Section 8, in place Section 8, NYCHA public housing, et cetera, it will not trigger
No.
a challenge in terms of your rent.
Nor would it impact food stamps or cash assistance. That is why it actually has such a phenomenal impact on combating poverty. It's a value add. It's not replacing anything.
That's really important for people to know. Are we also working with NYCHA, do you think? Is that large institution also cooperating on this issue?
Yes, I think the city actually has a interagency work group where they're leveraging all the large agencies that have large reach on trying to get the word out as well.
Okay, and I think that does the tenant assistance also impact? I believe it does include NYCHA residents, right?
It does now, yes, it does now, and there are special protocols being worked out. Some of this is sort of, some of this is the plane being built while it's flying, and that is definitely a little bit of what's happening with getting ERAP out the door. But NYCHA tenants were not eligible in the first month. They are now, and so we have started to see NYCHA tenants calling us for assistance, and we've started to help them with those applications. And there's going to be some easier, hopefully, direct communication with NYCHA to get all of the landlord documents that are needed.
I think we need to start to wrap up. I want to say that this is an example of the federal administration working for people who are most vulnerable, but also the fact that they have enlisted support, either as CCC, Jennifer March indicated, from foundations to try to reach out to the most vulnerable, that the city agencies are coordinating on that. That's really exciting. And as hard as it is to reach families, it's sometimes harder to reach tenants. I don't know how else to say it, only because of the challenging relationship between owner and tenant. And this should be an example where we're all working together. But if the owner of the building is not interested in having that tenant, then perhaps we'll end up in court. And that's what we want to avoid. I've always had nightmares about when the eviction moratorium ends, a long line at 111 Center Street. I literally have nightmares about it. Okay. Well, I want to thank both Jennifer Vallone and Jennifer March for taking time to discuss these important programs. The fact that it puts funding money into people's pockets in our very complicated city. I was so upset when Manhattan was described in the press as the most expensive county in the country. I was very upset about it. That is not a good banner or accolade. That is not an accolade. So hopefully this helps. We also are always trying, of course, to have more affordable housing, and maybe this will help because now you have more funding to be able to pay for the rent. I am Gale Brewer, Manhattan Borough President, and you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All three platforms is just Gale A. Brewer. And if you'd like to stay updated on what's going on in Manhattan, including the city's COVID response, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at manhattanbp.nyc.gov/subscribe. I want to say John Houston, Mia Edelstein, and others worked all during the pandemic to make this newsletter available to Manhattanites, and I want to thank them. So this has been Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and I want to thank two incredible guests for their knowledge and for keeping not just Manhattan, but New York City alive for those who need the help the most. Thank you both very much.